The gun was already drawn when Sadie Lockhart stepped through the jailhouse door, and the man holding it was not the marshal. He was Roy Cutter, and he smelled like 3 days of whiskey and something darker, something that had no name but lived in the eyes of men who had decided the world owed them everything and had grown tired of waiting to collect. He had the barrel aimed at Marshal Elias Vance, who sat behind his desk with his hands flat on the wood and his breathing very carefully controlled, the way old men control their breathing when they know a situation can go one of two ways, and only one of those ways ends with them alive. Sadie stopped. The door swung behind her and clicked shut, and Roy Cutter swung the gun toward her, and for one frozen second the three of them occupied a triangle of terrible possibility. "Mrs. Lockhart," the marshal said, and his voice was steady, steady as granite, steady as the mountains west of town. "I would ask you to leave." "She is not going anywhere," Roy Cutter said. His eyes were wet and red around the edges. "She is going to stand right there and listen to what I have to say, because she is the reason I am in this position, and she is going to hear it from my own mouth." Sadie did not move. She had learned long ago that moving too quickly in a room with a frightened man and a loaded weapon was the surest way to make both of those things worse. She kept her hands visible at her sides, and she looked Roy Cutter directly in the face, which was also something she had learned, because men like Roy Cutter were cowards at their core, and cowards lost some of their fire when the person they were threatening refused to flinch. "I am listening," she said. "You told the circuit judge about my ledger." "I did." The gun trembled. "You had no right. You were recording false debts against half the farmers in this county and collecting on them at gunpoint. 3 families lost their land because of numbers you invented in a book. I had every right." Roy Cutter took a step toward her, and Marshal Vance came out of his chair, and the room collapsed into noise and motion and heat. And when it was over, Sadie was pressed against the wall with her heart hammering, and the marshal had the gun, and Roy Cutter was on the floor with a split lip, and his wrists already being bound. And through the single window of the jailhouse, the late afternoon sun of Caldwell, Kansas, was burning orange and pitiless over the rooftops of a town that did not yet know how close it had just come to losing its one honest witness. Sadie had not always been the kind of woman who walked into jailhouses. She had not always been the kind of woman who testified before circuit judges or kept copies of incriminating ledgers tucked between the pages of her Bible. She had become that woman slowly, the way water becomes a river, starting from something quiet and small, and finding its direction only after it had no choice. She had come to Caldwell, Kansas in the spring of 1882, following her husband Thomas Lockhart, who had come to follow a dream of cattle and open land, and the kind of fresh beginning that the West was still selling to men who needed to believe in something. Thomas had been a good man. Not a complicated man, not a deep man, but good in the way that basic things are good, honest and warm and hardworking. And he had loved Sadie in the uncomplicated way that good men love women they have chosen, and chosen well. He died in the autumn of 1883, when a fever moved through the county like a slow fire and took 1/3 of the homesteaders who had arrived the previous year, the ones who had not yet built strong enough shelters and did not yet know the particular cruelty of a Kansas winter, moving in before a man had finished building his walls. Thomas died in 10 days. Sadie sat beside him for all 10 of them, and when it was done she sat for 2 more because she could not yet understand how the world continued making the sounds it made outside the window. She had 2 children, Eli, who was 6, and Clara, who was 4, and she had a homestead claim of 160 acres that she had no idea how to work, and a bank account with $47 in it, and a future that looked like the sky before a storm, enormous and empty and pressing down. She could have gone back east. Her mother wrote and told her to come home. Her sister wrote and told her to be sensible. Everyone with opinions about her life agreed that the sensible thing was to retreat, to pack the children and board the train and return to Ohio, and take up the narrow, predictable life that had been waiting for her before Thomas Lockhart showed up with his cattle dream and his persuasive smile. Sadie did not go. She could not have explained clearly why. Not at first. Not while she was still learning how to split firewood and bargain with suppliers and fix the fence line that Thomas had never quite finished along the northern edge of the property. Something in her had set itself against retreat with the same quiet ferocity that the prairie set itself against anything that tried to root there, fierce and stubborn, and prepared for a great deal of suffering before it would give up. She learned. She made mistakes and learned from them and made different mistakes and learned from those too. She hired 2 hands, brothers named Felix and Dario Montez, who were reliable and kind, and who taught her more about cattle management in 6 months than Thomas had known in 2 years. She made arrangements with neighboring farms to share equipment and resources. She attended every town meeting and every county commissioner session and every court date in Caldwell, because she had learned early that the decisions made in those rooms affected her land and her children and her livelihood, and no one was going to attend those meetings on her behalf. That was how she had found the ledger, not through any dramatic detective work, but through simple, relentless attention. She had been at a county commissioner meeting when Roy Cutter, who ran the only private lending operation in the county, presented paperwork claiming that the Henderson farm owed him $312, a sum that would force them to sell. She had known the Hendersons for 2 years. She had seen their accounts because she had helped Margaret Henderson keep her household books one winter when Margaret's hands were too cracked from cold to hold a pen. The Hendersons did not owe Roy Cutter $312. They did not owe him anything. She had gone to Roy Cutter's office the next morning and asked to see his records. He had laughed at her. She had gone to the county recorder's office and asked to see his filed documents. The clerk had been helpful, or perhaps simply too surprised by the directness of her request to think of a reason not to be. She had spent 3 days in that office, working through records, and what she found had made her hands go cold even on a warm afternoon. She had copied everything relevant by hand, because she was methodical, and because she had already learned that documents had a way of disappearing when people with power needed them too. She had given 1 copy to Marshal Vance, and 1 to the circuit judge's office in Wichita, and kept 1 in her Bible, and the result had been Roy Cutter's arrest, and the restoration of 3 farms and a great deal of hatred directed at Sadie Lockhart from the men in Cutter's social circle, which was not small. None of that had prepared her for Jasper Hunter. He arrived in Caldwell on a Tuesday in March of 1884, riding a dark bay horse with a white blaze on its nose and saddlebags that had clearly seen significant hard use, and he came recommended by the county sheriff's office as the new deputy marshal for the district, filling a position that had been vacant since the previous deputy had relocated to Colorado to care for an ailing father. Sadie did not meet him immediately. She met him the way she met most things, gradually and through accumulated information, which is to say she heard about him from 3 different people before she saw him face to face. Felix Montez told her first, coming in from town with supplies and the news that there was a new lawman, dark-haired and quiet, who had been in Tombstone before this and before that somewhere in New Mexico, and who had a reputation that Felix described in terms respectful enough that Sadie paid attention. Margaret Henderson told her second, at the weekly gathering at the church hall, where the women of the county exchanged seeds and recipes, and the information that actually kept a community running. Margaret said he was polite, which she said with the slightly surprised tone of a woman who had encountered a great many Western lawmen and found politeness among them to be rarer than it should have been. The third person to tell her about Jasper Hunter was Marshal Vance himself, who stopped by her farm on a Wednesday morning 2 weeks after the deputy's arrival with his hat in his hands, and an expression on his weathered face that she had come to associate with him about to ask her something he expected her to refuse. Deputy Hunter is doing a survey of the county, Vance said. Properties, boundaries, known disputes, that sort of thing, to familiarize himself. "That sounds sensible," Sadie said. "I thought you might be willing to speak with him. You know the county documents better than anyone outside the recorder's office." Sadie looked at him over the rim of her coffee cup. "You thought I might be willing," she said. "You did not simply assign him to come speak with me." Marshal Vance had the decency to look slightly uncomfortable. "He is going to be out this way on Thursday, if you happen to be willing to receive him." "I will be here Thursday," she said. He came in the late morning, when the light was still clear, and the wind had not yet picked up the way it did by afternoon. She heard the horse first and then saw him through the kitchen window, and her first thought was that he moved with unusual carefulness. The kind of carefulness that was not timidity but its opposite, the awareness of a man who understood exactly how much force he was capable of and had learned to keep it quiet and contained. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, she guessed, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that had not been shaved in several days and eyes that were a particular shade of gray that was almost blue in certain lights and almost green in others, and which settled on things with a steadiness that she found both unsettling and, she admitted privately, impressive. He knocked, she answered. "Mrs. Lockhart," he said, "I am Jasper Hunter. Marshal Vance said you might be willing to speak with me." "He said you would be out this way," she said. "Come in." He wiped his boots with more thoroughness than was strictly necessary, which told her something, and he removed his hat as he stepped inside, which told her something else, and he looked at the shelves of documents and ledger copies she kept in the front room with an expression of recognition rather than surprise, which told her quite a lot. "You have done considerable research," he said. "I have done considerable record-keeping," she corrected. "Research implies a beginning and an end. This is ongoing." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but the possibility of one. "Fair enough," he said. They spent 2 hours at her kitchen table, and he asked good questions, specific and logical, and he listened to the answers with the kind of full attention that was becoming increasingly rare in her experience, the kind that showed in the way a person's eyes stayed on you rather than sliding to the window or the door. He had a small notebook, and he wrote in it with a pencil, left-handed, which she noticed because she was the kind of person who noticed things. When he left, she stood in the doorway and watched him ride back toward town, and she felt something she had not felt in a long time, something she had no immediate plans to examine too closely, because she had 2 children and a farm to run, and a county full of Roy Cutters in various stages of scheming, and she did not have room in her life for whatever that feeling was. She encountered him again 10 days later in town, at the general store where she was picking up flour and salt, and a length of cotton fabric for Eli's shirt, which had acquired a tear in the shoulder that was beyond her ability to patch invisibly. He was at the counter speaking with the owner, a man named Holt who had a grudging honesty about him that Sadie had come to value. Jasper Hunter saw her come in and nodded, and she nodded back, and they occupied the small store with the careful politeness of 2 people who were both being deliberate about not making something out of nothing. She was at the fabric bolts when he appeared beside her, not crowding her just there. "Do you have a moment?" he said. It was not quite a question. "I have several," she said. "The flour is not going anywhere." He glanced around the store with the instinctive habit of a man who checked rooms for witnesses before saying things that mattered. "There is a situation developing," he said quietly, "involving the grazing rights on the southern parcels. 3 of the larger landowners have been pressuring the smaller claims. I suspect there is a paper trail, but I am having difficulty accessing the right records." Sadie looked at him steadily. "The filed claims from 1880 through 1882 are at the county recorder's office. The easements were registered separately, and the clerk, whose name is Aldrich, keeps them in a separate ledger that he does not always mention unless asked directly." Jasper Hunter looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not quite categorize. "How do you know that?" "Because I asked directly," she said. 3 times. The first 2 times he told me those records were not relevant. The third time I brought Margaret Henderson with me and we simply waited until he found them. This time he did smile, briefly and genuine, and it changed his face in a way that she filed in the back of her mind under things she was not examining. I will ask for Aldrich, he said. Ask for the ledger specifically, she said. The gray one with the red binding. He keeps it in the bottom drawer on the left. He nodded and turned to go, then turned back. Mrs. Lockhart, the men who were connected to Cutter, the ones who are still operating in the county, you know they consider you a significant threat. I am aware of their opinions, she said. I want you to be careful. She looked at him with the level gaze she had developed over 2 years of being underestimated by men who thought widows were soft targets. I have been careful, she said. It is what keeps me alive. He held her gaze for a moment and then nodded again and walked out of the store. And she turned back to the fabric bolts and allowed herself to feel, just briefly and privately, the warmth of being spoken to as an equal by someone who was not trying to flatter or condescend, but simply telling her the truth because he thought she deserved to know it. The trouble with the Southern grazing rights turned into a full investigation by late April, and it pulled Jasper Hunter back to her door twice more in the space of 3 weeks, and each time they sat at her kitchen table with maps and documents between them, and talked through the legal architecture of what was happening and what could be done about it. And each time the conversation lasted longer and ranged further than the documents strictly required. She learned things about him in pieces, the way you learn the landscape of a country by traveling it gradually. He had grown up in Virginia, which was unexpected given his demeanor, and had come west after the war, which was not. He had spent time in Tombstone during the period of its particular notoriety, and had known Wyatt Earp by sight and by reputation, and had strong opinions about both. He had been married once briefly, to a woman named Alice who had died of complications in childbirth along with the baby, and he spoke of this with the careful quietness of a person who had arrived at a place of peace with a great grief, but had not forgotten what the grief cost him to reach. He learned things about her too. About Thomas, who she spoke of with the honest affection of someone who had genuinely loved, but was no longer pretending that love had been a simple or unambiguous thing. About Ohio, which she spoke of with the mild nostalgia of a person who had left something behind and did not regret it. About Eli and Clara, who she spoke of with a directness and warmth that was completely unself-conscious, and which he watched with an attention she noticed and did not comment on. Eli and Clara were the center of her life in the way that children are the center of a life when you are the only parent, and the farm and the future are all one continuous project of keeping them safe and fed and growing. Eli was 7 now, serious and observant in ways that sometimes startled her, and Clara was 5, fierce and stubborn in ways that Sadie recognized as her own and tried to nurture carefully. They were good children, not because she had been lucky, but because she worked at it the way she worked at everything, with attention and patience and the refusal to take shortcuts. Jasper Hunter met them on a Saturday afternoon in early May, when he rode out with documentation from the recorder's office that needed her to confirm certain boundary markers from memory. Eli was in the yard with Felix's younger brother, who sometimes helped out on weekends, and Clara was at the edge of the garden with a stick she was using to draw shapes in the dirt that had a surprising geometric logic to them for a 5-year-old. Jasper dismounted and tethered his horse to the post and walked into the yard, and Clara looked up at him with the frank, uncalculating assessment of a small child who had not yet learned to be indirect about her evaluations. "You are the new deputy," she said. "I am," he said. "Your name is Clara, I believe." Clara considered this. "Mama told you. She mentioned you," he agreed. "She said nice things," Eli said, appearing from behind the fence with the slightly protective air of a 7-year-old boy who had appointed himself the household's secondary guardian. "She does not always say nice things about the lawmen." "Eli," Sadie said from the doorway where she had appeared with flour on her hands and a look that was somewhere between amused and exasperated. He should know, Eli said reasonably. Jasper Hunter looked at Sadie over the heads of her children with an expression that was entirely and genuinely amused. "I will try to earn my category," he said. They sat on the porch that afternoon after the documents were dealt with. Because the afternoon was warm and Sadie brought out water, and the children settled nearby with their own occupations, and the conversation drifted from county legal matters into the easier territory of books and opinions, and the nature of justice, which was a subject Jasper Hunter had clearly thought about considerably, and which Sadie had opinions on that were both more numerous and more strongly held than he had apparently expected, because he listened with a quality of attention that had an undercurrent of pleasant surprise. The sun moved across the sky and stretched the shadows of the fence posts long across the yard, and when he finally stood to go, Clara looked up from her geometric drawings and said, "You can come back." "Clara," Sadie said. "I am just telling him," Clara said, "in case he was uncertain." Jasper Hunter looked down at Clara and then up at Sadie, and the thing that passed between them in that look was warm and quiet and entirely unspoken, and it settled somewhere in Sadie's chest with the weight of something real. He did come back. Not on pretense, after a certain point, because the investigation into the grazing rights was resolved by June through the legal mechanism that Sadie's documents had made possible, and 3 of the smaller landowners kept their claims, and the larger operators who had been applying pressure were notified in terms that Marshal Vance described as unambiguous, which Sadie suspected meant that Jasper Hunter had been very specific with them in private about the consequences of continuing. He came back on a Sunday with a copy of a novel he had acquired from the lending library in Wichita when he passed through on official business, because in one of their conversations Sadie had mentioned she had not had access to a particular book, and he had apparently remembered this and acted on the remembering. She opened the door and looked at the book and looked at him. "I thought of you when I saw it," he said, with the directness of a person who had decided against pretense. She took the book. "Thank you," she said, and the warmth in her voice was not something she tried to contain. He sat on the porch again, because that was where they sat, and Eli came out and asked him questions about horses and then about Tombstone, which Jasper answered with care, leaving out the parts that were not suitable for a 7-year-old, and giving the rest with an honest detail that Eli received with the focused attention of a child storing things for later use. In the evenings after the children were asleep, Sadie sat with her own thoughts and tried to be honest with herself, which was a discipline she had maintained since Thomas died because she could not afford the luxury of self-deception. What she felt for Jasper Hunter was real. It was not loneliness or gratitude or the simple human need for company, although all of those things existed in her life. It was specific to him, to the way he listened and the way he thought, and the particular combination of steadiness and intensity that he carried with him like something he had earned at significant cost. She was also afraid of it, not in a small way. In the way that you are afraid of something you cannot afford to lose, which meant she was already thinking of it as something she had, which meant she was further along than she had realized. She was 31 years old. She had 2 children and a farm and a county full of people who either depended on her or resented her or both. She did not have space for mistakes, and love was the most spectacular mistake available to a person if they chose wrong. She did not think Jasper Hunter was a wrong choice, but she thought that very carefully and from multiple angles before she let herself believe it. July brought a new crisis, because the county never went long without one. A man named Devereaux, who operated a large spread east of town and had connections that ran deep into the political infrastructure of the county, began a campaign to discredit the records that had been used against Roy Cutter, and by extension to discredit Sadie herself. He spread the claim at meetings and in the saloon and through the informal networks that men like him used to shape public opinion, that the documents she had copied were selectively transcribed, that she had altered them to suit her purposes, that her testimony to the circuit judge had been the work of a woman with a personal grudge and no legal standing. It was sophisticated as attacks went, because it targeted the one thing that Sadie's usefulness depended on, which was her reputation for accuracy. If people doubted her records, they would doubt her testimony, and without her testimony, the legal mechanisms she had been using to protect the smaller landowners had no foundation. She found out about the campaign through Margaret Henderson, who came to her on a Wednesday morning looking worried in the specific way of someone who has news they do not want to deliver but cannot in conscience withhold. Sadie listened to all of it without interrupting, which was something she had taught herself. Then she sat with it for the space of several breaths. "He is trying to remove the only witness who has the relevant records," she said. "He is trying to destroy your name," Margaret said more directly. "Yes," Sadie agreed, "because destroying my name is easier than disputing the records themselves." She went to see Marshal Vance that afternoon. He was already aware, because Jasper Hunter had brought it to him that morning, and when she walked in, Jasper was there, standing at the window with his arms crossed and an expression on his face that she had not seen before, something controlled and deliberate that covered something else, something hotter. "He cannot dispute the original documents," she said to both of them. "The originals are still in the county recorder's office. If anyone cares to compare my copies to the originals, they will find them identical. I transcribed them exactly, and I kept the originals available specifically in case this kind of challenge arose." Marshal Vance looked at her with his steady, weathered eyes. "That is what I thought," he said, "but Devereux is counting on the comparison never being made." "Then we make it," Jasper said. He said it with a quietness that had an edge in it, the edge of a man who had made a decision and was done with the deliberating. He went to the recorder's office that afternoon and spent 4 hours making the comparison himself, document by document, and presented the results to Marshal Vance in a written report the following day. Sadie's copies were accurate. Every line, every figure, every annotation. The comparison was filed with the county records and sent to the circuit judge's office in Wichita and to the territorial papers, because Jasper Hunter had apparently decided that if the truth was going to matter, it was going to matter publicly and loudly, and in writing. Devereux's campaign collapsed within 2 weeks, not dramatically, but the way bad arguments collapse when they meet accurate evidence, quietly and without the satisfying sound of someone admitting they were wrong. Sadie met Jasper on the main street of Caldwell the afternoon. The news reached them that Devereux had withdrawn his complaints, and she stopped in front of him on the dusty boardwalk and looked at him with everything she was feeling visible in her face, because she had never been particularly good at hiding things from people who paid close attention, and he paid closer attention than anyone she had ever known. "Thank you," she said. "You would have done it yourself," he said. "I was going to," she agreed. "You did it faster and with more authority. The authority is the badge," he said. "The speed is because I was not willing to let it continue." She looked at him for a moment in the afternoon light in the middle of the dusty main street of Caldwell, Kansas, with horses moving past them and the sound of the saloon drifting from 2 buildings down. "Why?" she said. It was a direct question. She had learned to ask those because indirect ones wasted time and she valued time. He looked back at her with the gray eyes that were almost blue and almost green and something that might have been almost afraid. "I think you know why," he said. She did know. She had known for weeks. She looked at him a moment longer and then said, "Come to dinner on Sunday." "Yes," he said without hesitation. Sunday dinner was a complicated affair. Not because the cooking was difficult, but because Eli had formed opinions about Jasper Hunter that he was developing out loud during the meal, and Clara had decided that she was going to teach Jasper to play the card game she had invented, which had rules that changed according to Clara's assessment of the situation. And Sadie watched all of this from her end of the table with a feeling that was large and warm and slightly frightening in its completeness. After dinner, after the children were in bed, They sat on the porch in the cooling air of the summer evening, and the silence between them was the comfortable kind that requires trust to exist, and eventually he reached over and took her hand very slowly, giving her every opportunity to move it away, and she did not move it away. "I am not a simple man to be with," he said. "I want to be honest about that. I did not come to Kansas looking for simple," she said. "I have a dark past," he said. "Things I did and did not do in places that were less orderly than I wish they had been, in Tombstone and before." "I am not asking you to have lived perfectly," she said. "I am asking you to be honest with me." "I can do that," he said. "I have done little else since I met you." She turned to look at him in the dim light. "I know," she said. "It is one of the things." "One of the things," he repeated with a quiet question in it. She paused and then said it plainly because plainness was her nature and she was not going to abandon it for the sake of romantic convention. "That I have come to love about you." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I have been in love with you since you told me about the gray ledger with the red binding in the bottom left drawer." She laughed, and it was the kind of laugh that rises from somewhere genuine, and he smiled at the sound of it. And she leaned against his shoulder and felt the warmth of him solid and steady in the summer night, and thought that the prairie was large and the future was uncertain, and she had found something she had not been looking for, and was not going to pretend she had not found it. August brought a different kind of trouble. There was a man called Silas Cord who had come into the county from somewhere east, or said he had, and set himself up as a land agent claiming to represent Eastern investors interested in purchasing agricultural claims. He was smooth where Cutter had been crude and methodical, where Devereux had been political, and he was consequently more dangerous than either of them had been. Sadie became aware of him through the documents that passed through Caldwell's limited legal infrastructure, because she had established herself as someone the county recorder's office contacted when papers arrived with unusual features, which was a courtesy that had grown organically from the fact that she had twice now identified fraudulent documents that the clerk had not caught. When Silas Cord's purchase agreements began appearing, she read them with the careful attention she gave everything, and found what she was looking for in the third paragraph of the second page, which was the kind of location people hid things when they were trying to avoid having them found. The agreements contained a clause that effectively signed over mineral rights permanently and without limitation. On land where the primary value was agricultural, this seemed either irrelevant or a standard boilerplate insertion. But Sadie had been tracking something she had not yet mentioned to anyone, which was a series of geological surveys that the territorial government had commissioned 3 years earlier and never formally released. Surveys that suggested significant mineral deposits in the exact parcels where Silas Cord's purchase agreements were clustering. She brought it to Jasper on a Wednesday evening, which by now had become an established pattern, Wednesday and Sunday being the days that the official reason for his visits gave way to the real one, and sat across from him at the kitchen table with the documents between them. He read through everything she had assembled and did not interrupt, and when he finished he sat back and looked at her with the expression she had come to recognize, the one that was appreciation without condescension, recognition of an intelligence that was doing what it did and doing it well. "How long have you been tracking this?" he said. 6 weeks, she said. "Since his first set of agreements appeared. I wanted to be certain before I brought it to anyone." "You should have brought it sooner." "I needed to be certain," she repeated. "A wrong accusation based on incomplete evidence does more damage than a slow, correct one." He looked at her for a moment and then nodded, conceding the point. "What do you need from me?" "I need someone to formally request the survey documents from the territorial office," she said. "A private citizen can ask. A deputy marshal gets an answer." "I will send the request tomorrow," he said. "And in the meantime, I am going to compare every purchase agreement he has filed against the survey grid coordinates I reconstructed from the preliminary data in the public record," she said. He looked at the stack of papers she had assembled. You reconstructed the survey coordinates from public records. The preliminary surveyor's reports are public, she said. The final synthesis is what they sealed, but the preliminary data points, combined with what I know about the topography from the boundary surveys, give a workable approximation. Jasper Hunter looked at her across the kitchen table in the lamplight of a Wednesday evening and said, with a quality of feeling that was quiet and strong and completely unguarded, "Sadie, I do not know how this county managed before you." She felt the warmth of it all the way through. "It managed very badly," she said. "I have the records." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, the way he had been doing for weeks now, naturally and without ceremony, and they stayed like that in the lamplight while outside the Kansas night made its sounds, and the children slept upstairs, and the future held its shape above them. The survey documents arrived from the territorial office in September, obtained through Jasper's official request, and a follow-up letter that Marshal Vance signed after being briefed on the situation. They confirmed what Sadie had reconstructed from the preliminary data. The parcels where Sela's cord was clustering his purchase agreement sat directly over the most significant mineral deposit the territory had identified in a decade. Cord was arrested on a Friday in late September, charged with fraud and misrepresentation, and the purchase agreements were voided by the circuit judge 2 weeks later. 4 families who had already signed were restored to their full claims. Several who had been considering signing were spared. The night after Cord was taken into custody, Jasper came to the farm and they sat on the porch in the cooling September air, and he was quiet for a long while in a way that had something in it beyond the usual comfortable silence. "I need to tell you something," he said. She turned to look at him. His profile in the evening light was serious. "I have been offered the position of marshal," he said. "In Dodge City, it would be a significant appointment, the kind of position I spent years working toward." She said nothing and waited. "I am not going to take it," he said. "Jasper, I am not going to take it," he repeated. "I need you to know that it is not a sacrifice I am making with reluctance. It is a choice I am making with full knowledge of what I am choosing." She looked at him steadily. "What are you choosing?" He turned to face her fully. "This county, this farm, these children." He paused and then said it plainly because he had learned plainness from her and it had changed the way he spoke. "You." She was quiet for a moment. The night air moved across the porch and the distant sound of the farm settled around them. "You should not give up a significant appointment for a woman who has never asked you to," she said. "I am giving it up for a life," he said, "which is different. The appointment is a position. The life is," he gestured slightly, encompassing the farm and the darkness and the sound of Eli and Clara asleep upstairs. "This is what I want. I know what I want. I have known for a while." She looked at him for a long, clear moment. Then she said, "I want to marry you." He blinked. "I was going to ask you." "I know," she said. "I am asking first. That is my prerogative." He looked at her with the full and quiet joy of it, and then he said, "Yes, Sadie, I would like nothing more in this world." They were married in November, in the church on the main street of Caldwell, with Marshal Vance standing as witness and the Hendersons and half the county there, because news traveled in small communities and happiness, genuine happiness, was something people wanted to be near. Eli stood very straight in his good shirt and held the rings with the gravity of a boy who understood the weight of the occasion. Clara wore the dress Sadie had made from the cotton fabric she had bought at Holt's store, and managed to go the entire ceremony without reorganizing the seating to her satisfaction, which Sadie counted as a significant achievement. Jasper Hunter put the ring on her finger and looked at her with everything he had, and she looked back with the same, and Marshal Vance pronounced them married in his steady, weathered voice. And the county that had seen enough hardship and enough dishonest men and enough dark dealings finally had something unequivocal and clean to celebrate. The first winter of their marriage was the hardest thing Sadie had encountered since the year Thomas died, not because the marriage was hard, but because the winter was, the worst in memory, the kind of Kansas winter that came down on the plains like a judgment. The cattle needed constant attention. The fence lines required repair in temperatures that made every hour outside a contest of endurance. There were 3 nights when Sadie was genuinely afraid they would lose animals to the cold. What she had not had in the previous winters was someone beside her. Not because she had been incapable alone, because she had not been, but because there is a specific difference between being capable alone and having someone whose capability combines with yours into something greater than the sum of its parts. Jasper was not a farmer, and he said so without embarrassment, but he was resourceful, and he was not afraid of work, and he listened when Felix and Dario Montez told him what needed doing, and he did it with the thoroughness he brought to everything. The cattle survived, the fence held. In February, when the worst of the winter broke and the light began to take on the particular quality that announces spring is coming even while the cold is still present, Sadie stood at the kitchen window in the early morning and felt the specific satisfaction of having endured and prevailed and not having had to do it alone. Jasper came up behind her and put his arms around her and rested his chin on her head and looked out the same window. "We made it," he said. "We did," she said. "We usually do." "Usually," he repeated, with the warmth in his voice that she had learned to live inside of, the way you live inside a house that has finally become a home. Spring brought new life in the particular abundant way of the plains after a hard winter. The grass came up with an intensity that almost hurt to look at. The cattle multiplied as expected, and Felix and Dario spent the first weeks of May in a sustained and cheerful activity that was the opposite of everything winter had required. Eli, who was 8 now and deeply interested in the workings of the farm, followed Felix around with questions that Felix answered with remarkable patience. Clara, who was 6, had decided that the best thing about spring was that she could return to her outdoor geometric drawings, now expanded to cover a significant section of the cleared ground behind the house. In April, Sadie told Jasper that she was expecting a child. He sat very still for a moment when she told him, and then his face did something she had not seen it do before, which was become completely transparent. All of the careful containment dissolved, and what was underneath was pure and open and profound. "Are you well?" he said. "I am very well," she said. "Are you?" He stopped. She understood what the stopped sentence contained, the memory of Alice of what had been lost. "I am healthy and strong, and I have managed a farm through a hard winter," she said. "I am going to be fine." He took her face in his hands. His hands, which were not gentle hands in their origin but which had learned a specific gentleness with her, held her face with the tenderness of someone holding something precious with full awareness of its preciousness. "I know," he said. "I know you are going to be fine." She covered his hands with hers. "Are you happy?" "Sadie," he said with the simple enormity of it, "I am the happiest man in Kansas." In November, on a cold and clear afternoon, their son was born. They named him Thomas James Hunter, Thomas for the man who had brought Sadie to Kansas, and whose goodness she carried in her memory with honesty and without apology. James for Jasper's father, who had died when Jasper was 19, and who Jasper spoke of with the quiet grief of an old missing. Thomas James Hunter was a large, healthy, emphatically opinionated baby, who made his opinions known at significant volume from his first moments in the world, and who had Jasper's gray eyes and Sadie's stubborn set to his jaw, and who caused Eli to become immediately and involuntarily protective in a way he could not entirely explain, and Clara to become interested in the project of his education from the very first week, which Sadie thought was possibly the most characteristic thing each of her elder children had ever done. Jasper held his son in the lamplight of the bedroom in the farmhouse that had once been only Thomas Lockhart's farm and was now theirs in the complete sense of the word, and Sadie watched him from the bed where she was tired but fundamentally well, and he looked up at her with the gray eyes that were almost blue and almost green and said, "Thank you." "We did that together," she said. "We do everything together," he said. "I thank you for that most of all." The winter of 1885 and the spring of 1886 brought continued changes to Caldwell and the county around it. The railroad expansion that had been promised for 3 years finally materialized in a concrete form, with survey crews appearing in the spring and actual construction beginning by midsummer. This changed the economics of the region in ways that were mostly beneficial and occasionally difficult, as economic changes tend to be, and it brought new people and new businesses and new opportunities and new complications in roughly equal measure. It also brought a man named Aldous Price, who arrived in the county as the representative of a railroad land acquisition company, and who was, Sadie determined within the first week of his operation, the most dangerous person to arrive in Caldwell since she had come there herself. Not dangerous in the crude way of Roy Cutter or the methodical way of Silas Cord, but dangerous in the way of a man with genuine legal sophistication and institutional backing, and no particular commitment to the well-being of the people his institution was displacing. The railroad needed land for its line, and for the facilities that followed a line, and the prices it was offering were fair in some cases and insulting in others. And Price's job was to acquire as much as possible at prices as low as possible, which was legal and common and the way of business, but which was going to harm specific people in specific ways that Sadie was not prepared to simply allow. She spent 6 weeks educating herself on railroad land law, which was its own complicated territory, and on the specific legal protections available to homesteaders under the Homestead Act of 1862 and subsequent legislation, and on the precedents established in cases where railroads had overreached and courts had pushed back. She attended every meeting Price held and asked questions that required specific answers. She wrote letters to the territorial delegate's office in Washington and to 2 lawyers in Wichita who had experience in railroad litigation and who were willing to correspond. Jasper watched all of this with the now familiar combination of respect and concern that her more intensive investigations produced in him. He was not the kind of man who told her what to do. He was the kind of man who told her what he was worried about, which was a distinction she valued enormously. And what he was worried about was that Price had institutional resources that could make opposing him costly in ways that went beyond legal argument. "He has lawyers," Jasper said. "Multiple ones. Well-funded. I know," she said. "I have read their filings. Sadie, this could become something that requires more than your records and your testimony." "I know that too," she said. "I'm also writing to the attorneys who won the Northern Pacific land case in 1884. He looked at her for a moment. "You have been corresponding with them." "For 3 weeks," she said. He was quiet and then he said, "What can I do?" "Keep Price honest while he is operating in this jurisdiction," she said. "He is not going to do anything illegal if he knows the deputy marshal is paying attention." "I have been paying attention," he said. "Then keep doing that," she said. "And if he does anything that gives us a legal opening, write it down immediately." He did write things down, a habit he had acquired from her because she was right about writing things down, and he had told her so directly, which she appreciated. By September, he had a notebook with 4 documented instances of Price's agents making representations to landowners that were technically misleading about the timeline of the acquisition offers, which under territorial law constituted a form of misrepresentation. The legal action that resulted was not dramatic. It was the opposite of dramatic. It was a series of letters and filings and responses that stretched over several months and required patience of the sustained, unglamorous kind. The attorneys Sadie had engaged, who came up from Wichita and who spent 2 days at her kitchen table reviewing documents before they filed anything, were quietly impressed by what she had assembled, which they said carefully, and with the understatement of legal professionals who had learned not to sound surprised by the capabilities of their clients. The resolution came in the spring of 1887. The railroad company, confronted with the documented misrepresentations and the legal exposure they created, renegotiated its acquisition offers for 12 properties in the county. 7 families received significantly more money than they had been offered. 5 families whose land was not in the direct line of the railroad's needs were removed from the acquisition list entirely. Aldous Price left Caldwell on a Thursday morning in March without making any particular announcement of his departure, which was, Marshal Vance observed to Jasper at the time, a cleaner ending than most such situations produced. It was also Marshal Vance who said it, the thing that the whole county had been thinking in various forms for years. He said it to Eli and Clara and little Thomas, who was 1 year old and being held in Jasper's arms on the main street of Caldwell on the afternoon of the resolution, when the whole community had come out in the particular spontaneous way of communities that have been waiting for a specific thing to finally go right. Eli and Clara were standing near the marshal's office, where Vance had come out onto the boardwalk to see what the gathering was about, and Vance, who had known them since they were 6 and 4 years old and who had watched them grow up in the shadow of their mother's work, put his weathered hand on Eli's shoulder and looked down at both children with his steady, honest eyes. "Your mother," he said, in the direct way of a man who did not make speeches, "is the reason this town has any honesty left in it." Eli looked up at him with the solemnity of a 9-year-old who understood that a significant thing had just been said. Clara, who was 7 and had never met a significant moment she could not also make personal, said, "We know." "I thought you should hear it from me," Vance said, "so you know I know it too." Jasper, standing a few feet away with Thomas on his arm, heard all of it and looked across the crowd to where Sadie was speaking with the Hendersons and the Montez brothers and several of the families, whose situations had been improved by the legal action. And he watched her, the way she listened, and the way she spoke, and the way she moved through the world with the particular qualities she had always had, and he felt the full weight of everything the marshal had said land in him as simply and completely true. He crossed to her when the crowd began to loosen and put his free arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him briefly, the way she did when she was tired and happy at the same time, and he said quietly just for her, "The marshal just told your children that you are the reason this town has any honesty left in it." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What did Clara say?" "She said they know." Sadie laughed the genuine laugh that he had loved from the first time he heard it. "Of course she did." Eli looked like he was going to carry the statement around with him forever, Jasper said. "He probably will," Sadie said. "He is that kind of person." He pressed his lips to her temple briefly, there in the middle of the main street of Caldwell with the whole community moving around them and Thomas grabbing at the front of his shirt with one small determined fist. "Are you all right?" he said. She looked up at him. "I am better than all right," she said. "I am exactly where I want to be." That evening they had dinner at home, all 5 of them, because Thomas was old enough now to sit at the table in the high chair that Jasper had built, badly and then better and then finally well, over the course of 3 weekends in the barn with Felix's guidance and a good deal of determination. Eli talked about the railroad and what it meant for the county, and Clara talked about a bird she had seen that afternoon that she was convinced was a new species. And Thomas banged a spoon against the high chair tray with the sustained intensity of a person who has recently discovered percussion and is not prepared to let it go. Sadie moved through the kitchen with the ease of someone in their element, and Jasper watched her the way he always watched her, the way he had watched her from the first afternoon he sat at this table, with the awareness that he was in the presence of something rare and real, and his in the most complete and grateful sense of the word. After dinner, after the children were in bed, after Thomas had been settled with the extra padding that he required on evenings when he had been excited, they sat on the porch in the spring air, and it was quiet the way things are quiet when they are complete, not empty but full. "What happens next?" Jasper said, not anxiously but with genuine curiosity, the way he had learned to approach the future from her, as something to engage with rather than guard against. "Next," Sadie said, leaning against his shoulder, "we run the farm and keep the county honest and raise 3 children who are going to be extraordinary and occasionally exhausting." "3," he said. 3, she confirmed and let the information settle into the air between them. He turned to look at her and she was already looking at him, and his face did the transparent thing again, the way it had when she told him about Thomas. All the careful containment dissolved. "When?" he said. "October," she said. "If my calculation is right, which it usually is." He pulled her closer, his arm around her, and she felt him breathe, the deep breath of a person taking in something they could not quite believe they have been given. "A boy or a girl," he said. "I have no way of knowing that," she said. "We will find out in October." "I hope for a girl," he said. "One with your mind." "Clara already has my mind," she said. "And she is enough of a project for anyone." He laughed, and she felt it through the contact of his arm against her shoulder, and laughed with him, and the porch and the farm and the Kansas night held them in the easy way of things that fit. October brought a girl, as it turned out. They named her Mary Alice Hunter. Alice for the woman Jasper had lost and had honored in silence for years. The honoring that he offered now openly, and with Sadie's full knowledge and blessing. Because she was the kind of person who understood that honoring what came before was not a threat to what was present, but a sign of a person who knew how to love with integrity. Mary Alice was smaller than Thomas had been and quieter and possessed of an attention that made her parents look at each other with the parental recognition of a child who sees things that other children walk past without noticing. She had Sadie's coloring, the brown hair and the eyes that were hazel and clear, and she was from her earliest weeks a person who communicated in looks rather than noise, which was a relief after Thomas's enthusiastic percussion period. The household of 5, which was now 6, found its new shape. Eli, who was 10, took the older sibling role with a seriousness that was both touching and occasionally overbearing, which Clara told him clearly and regularly. Clara, who was 8, assigned herself the role of Mary Alice's education director and began this project immediately and with characteristic intensity. Thomas, who was nearly 2, was uncertain about the newcomer for several weeks, and then decided she was acceptable based on criteria that were entirely his own and which he did not share. Jasper Hunter, who had arrived in Caldwell 5 years earlier on a dark bay horse with saddlebags that had seen significant hard use, put his daughter in the crook of his arm and held her the way he had held Thomas, with the careful wonder of a man who could still be surprised by grace, and looked at Sadie with eyes that contained everything. "We have built something," he said. "We are building something," she corrected gently. "It is ongoing." "Fair enough," he said, which was what he had said to her at the very beginning in this kitchen at this table when she had corrected his first assumption about her, and it landed between them with the warmth of an inside language, the private vocabulary of a shared life. The years that followed were full in the way that years are full when a community is growing, and a family is growing, and there is always work to be done, and the work matters. The railroad brought new people to Caldwell, and the new people brought new needs and new complications and new opportunities. Sadie remained the person she had been, the one who paid attention to the documents and the records and the patterns, and the county remained a place where that kind of attention made a measurable difference. Marshal Vance retired in 1889, at the age of 64, and the position of marshal was offered to Jasper Hunter, who accepted it with the quiet ceremony of a man who had arrived at the place. He was supposed to be by a route that had been neither straight nor simple, but had been entirely his. His first act as marshal was to establish a formal county records access policy, which required that all official documents be available for public review, and that requests for access could not be denied without a written reason filed with the circuit court. This policy, which had no precedent in the county, and which several of the larger landowners objected to in writing, was modeled directly on the practices that Sadie Lockhart had been maintaining informally for 7 years. She did not comment on this when he told her. She looked at him across the kitchen table with the expression she had for things she found satisfying, but did not need to make large. "It is just the right thing," he said. "I know," she said. "I have been doing it for 7 years." "I know," he said. "I have been watching you do it for 7 years." She smiled, the specific smile that was for him and which he had learned to watch for. "Marshal Hunter," she said. "Mrs. Hunter," he said. "I am very proud of you." He looked at her with the full and simple fact of what they were. "I learned everything that matters from you," he said. "Not everything," she said. "You could always read a room faster than I could. You could always read a document faster than any room ever required," he said. She laughed, and he smiled, and Thomas, who was 4 now and had recently discovered that running was even better than banging things, came through the kitchen at speed with Clara in pursuit, and something in his hand that had originally been Clara's, and was clearly the subject of negotiations that had not yet reached conclusion. Eli, 13 and growing into his height with the slightly awkward grace of a boy becoming something more, appeared in the kitchen doorway and looked at his parents with the observant assessment that had always been his particular quality. "They are at it again," he said. "Handle it," Sadie said. Eli disappeared back into the hall with the long-suffering competence of an eldest child who has accepted his destiny. They heard his voice, measured and reasonable, and then Clara's, initially resistant and then gradually more persuadable, and then Thomas's, which went through several emotional registers before settling on something approaching satisfaction. "He is going to be a lawyer," Jasper said. "He is going to be whatever he decides to be," Sadie said. "But yes, quite possibly a lawyer." Mary Alice appeared at Sadie's side, which is where she preferred to be when she was not observing something from a distance, and put her small hand on Sadie's knee and looked up at her with the clear hazel eyes that saw things. She was 2 years old and not yet very verbal but extremely communicative, and what she communicated now was the desire to be picked up, which Sadie did, settling her on her hip with the ease of a woman who had been carrying children for a decade. Jasper watched his wife hold their daughter and felt the particular contentment that has no name because it does not need one. It exists in the body before it exists in language. It is the feeling of a life that has found its shape. The summer of 1890 brought the kind of event that reminds everyone that lives are not made up only of the things you choose. A fire moved through the southeast corner of the county in late August, a grass fire driven by a dry wind that had been building for 3 weeks, and it burned through 2 homesteads before the community got the water lines and the fire breaks organized effectively. No one was killed, which was a mercy that everyone acknowledged explicitly and with relief. But the Galindo family lost their house, and the Fredericks family lost their barn and half their equipment. And the aftermath was the kind of situation that required the community to remember that it was one. Sadie organized the aid effort with the same methodical attention she brought to her document work, which meant that within 4 days of the fire she had a complete accounting of what both families needed, what the county had available to contribute, and a schedule of work parties organized around the planting and harvest obligations of the contributing farms. Jasper, as marshal, coordinated the practical side, the material movement and the arrangements with the county stores and the church, which had offered its hall as a distribution point. What emerged from the fire, after the immediate crisis was managed, was a formalized community aid arrangement that had not previously existed in the county, a written agreement among 23 families to contribute labor and resources to any household that suffered a loss too significant for individual recovery. Sadie drafted the agreement, and Jasper witnessed it in his official capacity, and Marshal Vance, retired but present because disasters bring everyone out, added his name in the same steady hand he had used for 30 years of official documents. The Galindo and Fredericks families rebuilt. The Galindo house went up faster than its predecessor, because 20 pairs of willing hands are faster than 4. And when it was done, Maria Galindo stood in front of it and cried in the way of a person who has been relieved of a weight they had begun to believe was permanent. And her children stood around her, and her husband put his arm around her shoulders, and everyone who was present understood that this was what community was supposed to mean. By 1891, Caldwell, Kansas was not the same town it had been when Sadie Lockhart had arrived with Thomas and two small children and $47, and a homestead claim she did not yet know how to work. It was larger and better connected and more legally sophisticated and more internally organized, and the people in it who made it those things were numerous and various, and had contributed in ways that were their own. But there was a quality to the county's public life that traced its origin to one specific set of habits, maintained by one specific person over more than a decade of consistent and uncompromising attention to the truth of things. Eli was 14 and had begun corresponding with a lawyer in Wichita who had offered to consider him as a reading student when he came of age. Clara was 12 and had shifted her geometric drawings into something that her teacher described as mathematical thinking of an unusual order for her age. Thomas was 6 and had settled into a personality that was warm and direct and occasionally astonishing in its straightforwardness. Mary Alice was 3 and possessed of a quality of watchful intelligence that made everyone she met slightly more careful about what they said in front of her. Jasper Hunter was 39 years old and had been marshal for 2 years and was, by every measure available, exactly where he was supposed to be and doing exactly what he was supposed to do. And he knew this with the certainty of a person who has arrived somewhere after a long journey and recognizes the destination not by a sign, but by the feeling in the body of the wandering having stopped. Sadie was 38 years old and had been living in Caldwell for 9 years and had been Sadie Hunter for 7 of them. And the farm and the community and the family she had built from the ashes of her first life's sudden ending were real and solid and daily and completely hers. And she loved all of it with the deep, unceremonious love of someone who knows exactly what they have and chooses it again every morning. On a Saturday afternoon in October of 1891, when the light was the particular amber of a Kansas autumn, and the air had the first sharpness of the coming cold, Jasper found her in the kitchen going through the recent filings from the county recorder's office, because that was still how she spent Saturday afternoons and always would be, and he leaned in the doorway and watched her for a moment before she noticed him. She had a pencil behind her ear and flour on her hands from the morning's baking that she had not entirely removed, and her hair was coming out of its pins the way it always did by the afternoon, and she was reading a document with the focused, careful expression she brought to things that deserved full attention. She looked like exactly what she was, a woman who had made something real out of enormous difficulty and who was continuing to make it, present tense and ongoing, with no plans to stop. He crossed the kitchen and kissed the top of her head between the escaped strands of hair, and she leaned back against him without losing her place in the document. "Anything significant," he said. "The Morrison claim has a boundary inconsistency that someone is going to notice eventually and file on," she said. "I am going to write to Aldrich about it before it becomes a dispute." "Of course you are," he said, with the warmth that had been in his voice when he spoke to her for 7 years and which had not diminished but increased, because that is what happens when love is the real kind and the years are good ones. She set the document down and turned to look at him. "You have that look," she said. "What look?" "The one where you have been thinking about something and have decided to say it," he smiled. "I have been thinking about something." "I know," she said. "Say it." He pulled the other chair around and sat facing her close, his hands covering hers on the table where they were still slightly floury. "I want to build the addition," he said, "the east wing we have been talking about, a proper study for you, with enough shelving for everything you have in those boxes and room for what comes after." She looked at him. "That is a significant project." "I have been pricing the lumber," he said, "and Felix and Dario have offered their time in spring when the work is lighter. Eli wants to learn the construction." She was quiet for a moment, looking at his hands over hers. "You have been planning this for a while." "A few months," he said. "I wanted to have the specifics before I presented it." She looked up at him. "Because you knew I would ask." "Because I knew you would want to know the particulars," he said. "And because you deserve something built specifically for what you do. You have been working in this kitchen and in boxes for 9 years, and you deserve a room that is yours." The gratitude she felt was the deep kind, not the kind for a gift but the kind for being known. Being known so thoroughly that the specific shape of your needs could be anticipated and planned for with lumber prices and springtime labor schedules. "Yes," she said. "Build it," he smiled. "We will build it." She turned her hands under his and held them. "We do everything together," she said, returning what he had said to her years ago. "We do everything together," he agreed. Through the window the amber October light was doing what amber light does in October, which is to make everything it touches look like it has always been there and will always be. The farm was quiet in the particular Saturday afternoon way of a place where the work is done for the day and the evening is still coming. Somewhere in the house, Thomas was doing something that produced a periodic thumping that was not alarming, but was continuous enough that Sadie noted it in the back of her mind. Clara's voice floated from the direction of the barn, where she had apparently established an outdoor classroom for Mary Alice, whose voice came back in the clear, carrying tones of a 3-year-old with things to say. Eli appeared in the kitchen doorway, 14 and long-limbed and serious in the way he was always serious, and looked at his mother and his stepfather sitting at the table with their hands together and said, "The thumping is Thomas. He is building something with the firewood. I told him to put it back when he is done and he agreed, which probably means he will put back most of it." "Thank you, Eli," Sadie said. Eli nodded and disappeared back into the house, and they heard his footsteps on the stairs, even and measured, the footsteps of a boy who moved through the world with intention. Jasper looked at Sadie. "He is going to be extraordinary." "They all are," she said, "in their completely different ways, including the one who is currently deconstructing the firewood pile. Thomas has an engineering instinct," she said. "It just does not yet come with a strong sense of consequences." Jasper laughed, the full and unconstrained laugh that was his when he was completely at ease, and she felt it in her chest the way she felt everything about him, present and specific and real. "I love you," he said, with the directness he had learned from her and made his own. "I love you," she said, with the certainty of someone saying a true thing that does not need embellishment. The study was built in the spring of 1892. Felix and Dario and Eli and 2 men from neighboring farms came on 3 consecutive Saturdays and built it with the solid, competent construction of people who knew what they were doing and had the right lumber and enough time. It was a good room. East-facing, which Sadie had specified because the morning light was best for reading. Shelves on 2 walls, built to Sadie's dimensions, which were generous. A desk she had bought from a furniture maker in Wichita, solid walnut, the best she had ever owned. A second chair for when someone came to discuss something, because people had always come to her kitchen table to discuss things and would now come to her study. When it was done and the last of the construction materials were cleared away, she stood in the doorway of the room and looked at it. Jasper stood behind her. "What do you think?" he said. She looked at the shelves and the desk and the east-facing window and the room that was hers, built specifically for what she did and who she was. "I think," she said slowly, "that I have been very well loved." He put his hands on her shoulders and kissed the back of her head. "You have been," he said. "You are, you will continue to be." She turned and looked at him, and the morning light was coming through the east-facing window and landing on both of them. And she thought about Ohio and Thomas Lockhart, and the $47, and the fence line that had never been finished, and the long winter and Roy Cutter and Sela's cord and Aldous Price, and the gray ledger with the red binding in the bottom left drawer, and Marshall Vance telling her children that she was the reason the town had any honesty left in it. And Jasper on a dark bay horse with well-worn saddlebags, and the table and the documents and the Wednesday evenings and the porch and the children and all of it. The whole, long, demanding, beautiful, difficult particular thing of a life she had built from materials she had not originally chosen but had used with everything she had. She put her hand on his face, the familiar face she had been looking at for 8 years, the face that had become as necessary to her daily existence as air or water. "I have been very well loved," she said again, "and I am very well here." "So am I," he said. "So am I." From somewhere in the house, Thomas called for his mother in the carrying, unself-conscious voice of a 7-year-old who has not yet learned to modulate. And Clara's voice came from another direction entirely, in a tone that suggested she was in the middle of explaining something important. And Mary Alice appeared suddenly at Sadie's hip, looking up at both of them with her clear, watchful eyes. And the morning came through the new east window, and everything was full. Sadie looked at Jasper Hunter over the head of their daughter, and he looked back at her. And what was between them was not a secret or a dark past, or a forbidden longing or a forced choice, or a betrayal survived or a trap escaped, though it had been all of those things in its passage. What it was now, standing in the morning light of a room built for her in a life built together, was simple and complete and lasting. It was the kind of love that arrives after honesty has done its work. The kind that knows itself clearly and chooses itself daily, and does not require the drama of uncertainty, because it is past uncertainty, built on the bedrock of two people who had looked at each other without pretense from the beginning and found, in what they saw, something worth everything they had. The study would hold her papers for another 20 years. The farm would grow and prosper, and be eventually joined by Eli's law practice, which he established in Caldwell in 1900, having passed his bar examination on the first attempt, and having declined a position in Wichita because his family was here, and this county still needed what he knew how to do. Clara would go to a teacher's college in Kansas City in 1897, and come back 2 years later with a certificate and a mathematical mind that reshaped what was taught in the county school for the next 15 years. Thomas would manage the expanded farm with Felix's son after Felix and Dario retired, and he would do it with a combination of his mother's systematic thinking and his own particular instinct for how things fit together, which turned out to be very well. Mary Alice, who had been watching the world with those clear hazel eyes since before she could speak, would in her own time become a county recorder, the first woman in the position, appointed in 1905, and would maintain the records of the county with an accuracy and a moral seriousness that caused people to say, quietly and then loudly, and then as a matter of common knowledge, that she was her mother's daughter in the truest sense. And Jasper Hunter, who had arrived in Caldwell in 1884 on a dark bay horse with saddlebags that had seen significant hard use, remained its marshal for 19 years, and was known for a particular kind of justice that was patient and thorough, and rooted in the conviction that the truth, carefully documented and honestly maintained, was the strongest thing in any county that wanted to survive its own history. He retired in 1903 at the age of 53 in good health, with his wife beside him and his children around him, and a county that was, by most honest assessments, as fair and as orderly and as honest as a county on the Kansas plains could reasonably be. On the day of his retirement, standing on the boardwalk in front of the marshal's office for the last time in his official capacity, he was asked by the new marshal, a young man from Wichita who had been carefully selected and thoroughly interviewed, what he would say was the most important thing he had learned in 19 years. Jasper Hunter looked at Sadie, who was standing a few feet away with Mary Alice beside her and Thomas just behind, and Clara nearby and Eli at the edge of the gathering with his lawyer's precise attention. All of them gathered because they were that kind of family, the kind that showed up for each other's endings and beginnings and ordinary Tuesdays alike. He thought about the question. Then he said, "The truth is not fragile. It does not need to be protected from examination. The people who protect it, who maintain it patiently and at personal cost and without requiring recognition, are the ones who make it possible for a community to be worth living in." He looked at Sadie while he said it, and she looked at him, and she knew what he meant because she had known him for 19 years, and she knew what he was made of and where it had come from, and she felt it land in her the way true things land, quietly and completely, and without fanfare. The gathering dispersed. The new marshal went inside to begin whatever beginnings were his. The day moved forward as days do, indifferent to the significance humans assign to particular moments and generous with its light regardless. Jasper walked over to her and put his arm around her shoulders, the simple and natural gesture of a man and a woman who had been choosing each other for a very long time and planned to continue. "What now?" she said, because it was the question she had asked before, and she liked what he had said then. He looked out at the main street of Caldwell, at the buildings and the people and the 20 years of a place becoming itself. "Now," he said, "we go home." She leaned against him. "Yes," she said, "let us go home." They walked down the boardwalk together, and the afternoon light of Caldwell, Kansas, came down on them in the generous, uncomplicated way of light that has no agenda. And everything they had built was behind them and around them and ahead of them, and it was real and it was theirs and it was enough, and more than enough, and everything.